Chapter 1. The Whispering Widow. It was on one of those dismal March mornings, when the sky broods like a sullen child above the grey sprawl of London, that I found myself once again seated in the familiar quarters of 21B Baker Street. The fire was low, yet the air remained thick with the scent of Turkish tobacco and damp wool, the latter clinging to my coat after my short walk from Cavendish Square. Holmes was seated opposite me, his long limbs drawn close, and his sharp, hawk-like features half hidden by the upturned collar of his dressing gown. A violin rested idle on the table beside him, though his fingers tapped thoughtfully against the armrest, and his eyes betrayed an active mind that had not yet surrendered to the day's lassitude. "I see you've returned from the clinic," Holmes remarked, without shifting his gaze from the speckled patterns of soot on the hearthstone. I smiled faintly. "Your powers of deduction remain unnerving as ever, Holmes." "Elementary, my dear Watson. There is a faint trace of iodine on your cuff, your left boot is damp from the slush outside, and you carry a slight lean to your right side, presumably to compensate for the weight of that medical bag which I note you've since deposited by the door." I chuckled. I suppose it would be more disconcerting if you ever failed to notice such things. Before Holmes could offer one of his typically indifferent rejoinders, there came a knock, soft, uncertain, yet persistent, at the door below. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, muffled but distinct. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes?" "Send her up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called back, rising with a flicker of interest. "Watson, I suspect our morning is about to become rather more engaging." Moments later, the door creaked open to admit a woman of no more than 35 years, her figure slight, her face pale, and drawn beneath a veil of modest black crape. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the room, and it was evident she had either suffered a recent grief or was presently in the grip of one. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes stepped forward and offered her a seat. "You are among friends, madam. Pray compose yourself and tell us how we may be of assistance." "My name is Mrs. Lydia Verney," she began, removing her veil to reveal dark eyes rimmed with fatigue. "I am, or rather I was, the wife of Charles Verney, the noted antiquarian." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "The same Mr. Verney who once advised the British Museum on the authenticity of the Eltanin tablets?" A faint nod. "Yes. But I fear my husband is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was found 3 nights ago in his study, collapsed beside his desk, an expression of utter terror frozen on his face. The coroner attributed it to apoplexy, but—" Here she faltered, her hands clenching in her lap. "I'm not convinced. There are strange circumstances."
Holmes seated himself opposite her, his steepled fingers resting beneath his chin. "Strange circumstances, Mrs. Verney, often prove to be the most illuminating. Pray continue." She hesitated, then drew a folded scrap of yellowed paper from her handbag. "This was found in his desk drawer. It is not in Charles's hand, nor is there any signature, but the words, they have haunted me." Holmes unfolded the note and read aloud. "He who listens to the voice that whispers behind stone will lose his breath to silence, and his soul to the dust of forgotten kings." He turned it over, then looked up. "No watermark, ink common, paper of French origin, roughly 20 years old. And this arrived? When?" "I believe he received it 2 days before his death. He became withdrawn, agitated. He would lock himself in the study for hours and murmured of voices, whisperings that came from the walls of his library." "Voices?" I asked. "Do you believe your husband was suffering from some mental malady?" "I thought so at first, Dr. Watson. But then, 2 days ago, after his death, I heard it too. A faint whispering, like wind through a keyhole, but with words. I could not make them out, but they were there, I swear it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what became of the contents of his study?" "The police sealed the room pending the coroner's report. They dismissed the note as the ramblings of a disturbed mind." "And you, Mrs. Verney, do you believe your husband was murdered?" She hesitated again. I do not know, but something unnatural occurred in that room. And if there is even a chance that foul play was involved, I could not live with myself if I failed to seek the truth." Holmes stood. "Then seek it we shall. Come, Watson, fetch your coat. We are to visit the Verney residence immediately. The widow's lips trembled in gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. As we stepped out into the wind-lashed streets of Marylebone, I glanced sidelong at Holmes, who was deep in thought. Well, Holmes, I ventured, do you think there's anything to the whispering? Or is it merely grief twisting the mind? He gave no answer for a moment, then murmured, A man of Charles Verney's intellect is not easily unmoored from reason. And this note, there is method in its madness. No, Watson, there is something here, something very old and very dangerous. And with that, he hailed a cab, leaving the grey city behind as we sped toward the House of Whispers. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Library. The house at 17, Wexbridge Terrace, was a brooding edifice of soot-blackened stone, standing aloof from the neighbouring townhouses like a scholar in mourning. Its high windows stared blankly into the overcast sky, and the ivy clinging to its facade gave it the aspect of something ancient, half forgotten. Holmes dismounted from the hansom with a curt nod to the driver, while I followed with a sense of foreboding I could not easily dispel. Mrs. Verney unlocked the heavy front door with a key that trembled in her gloved fingers. The interior, though tastefully furnished, was dim and oppressive. Thick carpets muffled our steps, and the silence felt like a presence in itself. This way, she said quietly, leading us down a long corridor, panelled in dark walnut. She stopped before a broad double door, its brass handles cold and untouched. The study I have not entered since that night. Holmes took out a pair of kid gloves and slipped them on with care. You will permit us a few moments alone, Mrs. Verney? She nodded once, gratefully, and retreated. The door creaked as Holmes pushed it open. The air within was stale, as if it had not stirred since the moment of Charles Verney's death. Books lined every wall, reaching nearly to the coffered ceiling. The desk, a great mahogany structure of Gothic design, stood in the centre, its surface still scattered with papers, a snuffed oil lamp, and a cracked teacup. A faded Persian rug bore a dark stain near the foot of the chair where, presumably, Vernet had fallen. Holmes moved as silently as a ghost, his gaze darting from object to object. He made no sound for several minutes, and I refrained from disturbing his process. You observe, Watson, he finally said, that while the body was found collapsed beside the desk, there is no evidence of a struggle. Yet look here. He pointed with his cane toward the lower shelf of a nearby bookcase. See how the dust has been disturbed? As if something heavy was recently moved. I crouched for a better look. A faint outline in the dust showed where a thick volume had once rested. May I asked, reaching for a book to test the fit. Holmes held up a hand. Carefully, Watson. Do nothing hastily. He leaned forward, examining the shelf's inner edge, then tapped twice with his knuckles. The sound rang hollow. A false panel, he murmured, common enough in older homes, though rarely so cleverly concealed. He withdrew a narrow blade from his coat and probed the wood. With a slight pressure, the back of the shelf clicked and tilted inward on a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a small, age-darkened scroll wrapped in velvet. Holmes extracted it reverently. Curious. Parchment, not paper. And the stitching? Ottoman, perhaps? Or earlier? He unfurled it slowly, revealing symbols that bore no resemblance to any known alphabet. This, Watson, he said softly, is what our Mr. Verney died to protect. Or perhaps what he died for finding. Before I could respond, a sound cut through the silence, a low, whispering murmur, like wind rustling dry leaves in a distant corridor. Holmes's head snapped up. You heard that? He asked. I nodded. It came from the walls. Holmes crossed the room in 3 long strides, placing his ear to a narrow gap between 2 bookcases. There's a void behind this section, possibly an old servant's passage walled up during renovations. He stepped back and scanned the walls above. Note the irregular plastering. This segment was reworked in recent years, likely to conceal the space. He turned sharply. Mrs. Verney said the whispering began after her husband received the letter. If there's someone, or something, within these walls, we must find a way in. Just then, the door opened quietly behind us. A man in his 60s entered, tall and cadaverously thin, with a face like bleached parchment. He wore the simple livery of a domestic servant and carried a tray with tea untouched. "I beg your pardon, sirs," he said in a dry, formal voice. "I am Dyson, the house steward. Mrs. Verney asked me to see if you required anything." Holmes turned and gave him a long, appraising look. "Were you in service to Mr. Verney long?" 21 years, sir. I maintained the household and oversaw his collection." "Then you will have known the contents of this room intimately." Dyson's eyes flickered to the open shelf, then to the scroll in Holmes's hand. "I was not aware that compartment could be opened." Holmes's expression did not change. "And were you present the night your master died?" "No, sir. I was in the kitchens. Mrs. Verney summoned me when she found him." Holmes nodded faintly. "You may go?" Dyson bowed and withdrew. Holmes waited until the door had closed, then turned to me. "Mark him well, Watson. That man knows more than he says." "You suspect him?" "I suspect everyone until I have reason not to. But consider, if Verney unearthed something dangerous, this scroll, say, or its contents, then it is quite plausible someone close to him had reason to ensure he never shared it." He turned back to the desk and picked up a small bronze coin resting on the blotter. "Ah, Greek? Macedonian, if I'm not mistaken. This may tie in with the references to forgotten kings in the note." "You think this has something to do with ancient tombs or treasure?" "I think," Holmes said, "that Charles Verney stumbled upon a secret someone was willing to kill to keep buried." There was a sudden creak, a floorboard above us, followed by a faint scuffle. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We are not alone in this house, Watson." He strode to the door and opened it with deliberate speed. The corridor was empty, but the air was tense with the sense of recent movement. As we stepped into the hallway, Holmes paused. "Come," he said, voice low. "The house yields its secrets reluctantly, but it will yield them all the same." Chapter 3. The Passage. Beneath the wind had picked up by the time Holmes and I returned to the Verney residence later that evening. A thick fog had descended upon Wexbridge Terrace, lending the street an eerie quality, as though the very air conspired to obscure what should have been clear. Holmes, however, was in no mood for superstition. "I have obtained the blueprints," he announced, producing a folded sheaf of vellum from inside his overcoat. "Courtesy of the City of Westminster Archives, the Verney house, it seems, is not quite what it appears." We entered quietly through the side entrance, where Mrs. Verney met us with a candle and a troubled expression. "There have been more sounds," she said. "Twice this afternoon. Low murmurs, behind the walls again. Dyson says it's just settling pipes." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And do you believe him?" She hesitated. "No, Mr. Holmes, I do not." Without another word, he turned down the corridor and led us to the study. Once inside, he unfurled the blueprints upon the desk and traced his finger along the central layout. "Observe," he said. "Here's the west wall of the study, the one with the bookcase. Now look beneath it. This symbol here indicates a crawl space, possibly a former coal chute or servants' corridor, bricked up decades ago." I leaned closer. "So there's access?" "There was," Holmes corrected, "and I believe it remains hidden in plain sight." He walked briskly to the far corner of the study, where a narrow, antique cabinet stood. It was an ornate piece, carved with scenes of ancient Troy and resting on clawfoot legs. Holmes knelt and ran his fingers along the skirting board behind it. "Help me shift this, Watson." We pulled the cabinet away, revealing a section of the wall with a shallow indentation and a faint seam running vertically through the panel. "A concealed door," Holmes murmured. "Cleverly disguised, but the tools of joinery always leave a trace." He pressed along the seam until there was a soft click. With a creak that seemed to echo from another century, the panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark opening. The air that flowed from it was dry and cold, carrying with it the faint odour of dust and something more, something ancient. Holmes lit a lantern and stepped inside. I followed with some reluctance. The passage was cramped, the ceiling low, and the walls of rough unplastered stone. There were no signs of modern fittings, no wires, no pipes. This was old, possibly centuries old. We walked in silence for several yards until the corridor widened into a narrow chamber, the walls lined with brick and mortar. In the centre stood a heavy wooden table upon which rested a collection of curious items, several fragments of bone, an oil lamp long extinguished, and a thick ledger bound in cracked leather. Holmes examined the bones first. Human. likely from an archaeological dig. See the markings here? These are chisel marks, tools used to separate the skull from the spine. Crude and careless. He then turned to the ledger. Opening it carefully, he flipped through several pages of scrawled notes, diagrams, and obscure symbols. "It's Verney's handwriting," he said. He kept a detailed record of his findings. Listen to this. 13th February. The chamber is real. Beneath the foundations. "I found the seal today, 3 concentric circles etched into the stone." The voice came again, louder this time. "I dare not tell Lydia. If I break the seal, I may find what was meant never to be uncovered." He closed the book slowly. A sealed chamber. Voices and bones. Whatever Verney discovered, it terrified him. Before I could speak, a noise rang out above us. Not a whisper this time, but a dull, deliberate knock. Then another. 3 in total. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood in darkness, barely daring to breathe. The sound came again. Footsteps above, slow and deliberate, then the creak of a door somewhere distant. Holmes whispered, "We are being watched, Watson. Whoever is behind this knows we've come too close." We waited several minutes in silence before Holmes relit the lantern. "We return," he said, "but not by the corridor." He guided us instead through another narrow path, one which sloped gradually upward. It led, eventually, to a wooden door. Holmes pushed it open cautiously, and we emerged, much to my surprise, inside the narrow servants' stairwell on the eastern side of the house. "Remarkable," I muttered. "A network of tunnels under the entire house?" Holmes nodded. "Built, perhaps, for reasons long forgotten, but someone has remembered them." Back in the study, Holmes locked the secret panel and replaced the cabinet. Mrs. Verney was waiting outside, her eyes wide. "I heard something," she said. "Thumping from below. Are you unharmed?" "We are," Holmes said. "But your husband's death was no accident. Someone feared what he uncovered, and they still do." At that moment, Dyson entered again, stiff as ever, but with a forced casualness that immediately struck Holmes. "Dyson," Holmes said without turning, "have you ever been beneath this house?" I don't know what you mean, sir." "I think you do. Tell me, who has access to the cellar?" Dyson hesitated a second too long. "Only I and the groundsman, Mr. Barrow." "Summon him at once, and don't leave this room." The steward turned on his heel and departed. Holmes watched him go, then turned to Mrs. Verney. "Tell me, this Barrow, how long has he been in your husband's employ?" She frowned. "Not long, 6 months perhaps. I never spoke with him much. Charles hired him after a dig near Kent." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden intensity. "Kent? Yes, a Roman site, I believe. He was very excited about it. Said he found something that contradicted accepted history." Holmes turned away, deep in thought. "Watson," he said at last, "the threads begin to weave together." Verney uncovered more than bones and tablets. He uncovered a secret someone would kill to protect. "And now?" "Now," Holmes said quietly, "we watch. Tonight, someone will return to that chamber, and when they do, we shall be waiting."
Chapter 4. Midnight Among the Stones. The fog had thickened by midnight. From the upper floor of the Verney residence, the windows gave out onto a street so veiled in grey vapour it may well have led nowhere. Holmes stood by the casement, unmoving, his lean figure partially lit by the glow of a single oil lamp. I sat nearby, suppressing a yawn and clutching my revolver, a precaution Holmes had insisted upon. "Are you certain the intruder will return tonight?" I asked, my voice low. Holmes didn't turn. "I am certain that whoever has been moving through this house under cover of darkness has grown bold. They've had the liberty of days, but now they know someone is watching. Tonight, that liberty ends." We waited in silence. The house was still, every creak and groan of its aged frame amplified by the hush of night. Mrs. Verney had retired, though not without apprehension. Dyson had retreated to his room, and Mr. Barrow, the elusive groundsman, had yet to make an appearance despite being summoned. Then just after 1 o'clock, a sound stirred in the corridor. A floorboard groaned beneath a slow, deliberate step. Holmes raised a finger and crossed to the door. He opened it an inch and peered through. There, moving stealthily along the hallway, was a figure shrouded in black. Tall, cautious, and bearing a covered lantern, the individual passed the guest rooms and descended the servants' stairwell, making not a sound. Holmes motioned for me to follow. Together we slipped into the dark, trailing the stranger at a careful distance. Down the narrow stairwell we crept, emerging into the shadowy kitchen quarters. The stranger, unaware of our presence, moved with purpose to the pantry wall, knelt, and pressed his hand against the panel Holmes had discovered earlier that day. The concealed door opened without a sound. The figure slipped inside. Holmes reached the passage just in time to keep the door ajar. We followed. The tunnel beyond was silent as a tomb. The intruder carried a lantern hooded with dark fabric, casting a feeble light just ahead. Holmes and I crept behind, staying in the narrow darkness. Our footsteps matched to the others.
The man did not return to the chamber we had found earlier. Instead, he took a sharp turn at a fork in the corridor, one we had not explored. The passage sloped downward again, and soon we were moving beneath the very foundations of the house. Then the intruder stopped. We halted instantly. He reached into his coat and retrieved a key, which he used to unlock a small iron door set into the wall. Beyond it was a second room, one far larger than the Chamber of Bones. Holmes's eyes gleamed as we peered in. The room was circular, with ancient stonework that bore no resemblance to any known architectural style. In the center stood a slab of black marble, etched with concentric rings filled with strange markings. Around the edges, fragments of pottery and shattered idols littered the floor. And against one wall, slumped in shadow, was another figure, unmoving. The man with the lantern crossed to the slab and removed a bundle from his coat, the scroll we had found earlier. He placed it in the center of the stone, then began speaking softly in a language I did not recognize. Holmes turned to me, his voice barely audible. "He's attempting a ritual, or at least something he believes to be one." "Then he's mad?" "Not necessarily. Madness is often guided by conviction, but I fear this conviction has already led to death." Holmes drew his pistol. "Follow me." We stepped into the room. The man whirled around. His face was half covered by a scarf, but his eyes were unmistakable. "Dyson," Holmes said coldly. The steward backed away from the slab. "You shouldn't be here." Holmes advanced slowly. "Neither should you, but here we are. You've been entering these passages for days. You removed the original scroll from Mr. Vernet's desk before the police arrived and replaced it with a copy, one designed to mislead." Dyson's hands twitched. "You don't understand." "On the contrary," Holmes continued, "I understand all too well. You and Mr. Barrow were both present on that Kent dig. You discovered this chamber, an ancient burial site, perhaps a forgotten sect sanctuary. But instead of reporting it, you brought its artifacts here. Why? Were you attempting to translate them, or merely drawn in by the mythology they carried?" Dyson said nothing. He glanced at the body slumped in the shadows. Holmes turned. I moved forward and knelt beside the figure. It was Barrow. His neck bore signs of strangulation, his eyes fixed in a glassy stare. Holmes spoke again, his voice low. "You silenced him tonight, didn't you?" He knew too much. Perhaps he threatened to go to the authorities, or perhaps he simply wanted the treasure for himself. Dyson trembled, his hand moving slowly toward his pocket. Holmes raised his pistol. "I wouldn't." With a sudden movement, Dyson lunged, not at Holmes, but toward the stone slab, knocking the scroll to the floor and reaching for a small object tucked beneath it. A metallic click followed. Holmes stepped forward, kicked Dyson's hand aside, and retrieved a slender dagger from the slab. "So that's it," Holmes murmured. "A ritual blade, bronze, likely older than the Roman Empire. You believed it had power, didn't you, Dyson? That if you performed the rites correctly, something would awaken." Dyson slumped to the floor, exhausted. "He was obsessed," he muttered. "Vernet." He said the symbols told a story, that this place was sacred, that if we listened, we'd hear the truth of what lies beneath London itself, not pipes, voices, ancient voices. Holmes looked around the chamber with a calculating gaze. "You listened too long, Mr. Dyson." Within moments, we had summoned the police via a signal whistle. Holmes presented them with both Barrow's body and the evidence of Dyson's cultic activities. The constables, baffled by the nature of the chamber, sealed off the passage and took Dyson into custody. Later, as we stood outside under a thinning fog, Holmes turned to me. "Madness wears many masks, Watson, but few are as dangerous as those cloaked in history and myth. Vernet tampered with something far older than he understood." "You believe the voices were real?" Holmes stared out into the gloom. Real enough to drive a man to murder. That, my dear Watson, is reality enough. Chapter 5. The Manuscript and the Map. 3 days had passed since Dyson's arrest and the unearthing of the ancient subterranean chamber beneath Wexbridge Terrace. The story had trickled into the morning papers under such headlines as "Antiquarian's Death Linked to Cultic Ritual" and "Servant Held in Gruesome Case of Hidden Tomb." But, as was often the case, the truth had been dulled by the press's appetite for sensation. Only Holmes, I suspect, found no relief in the quiet conclusion suggested by official statements. It was late afternoon when I returned once again to Baker Street to find Holmes, seated not by the fire, but at the centre table, his fingers stained with dust and ink, surrounded by various artefacts and documents. A large map of London had been spread open before him, weighed down at the corners with a bronze statuette, a snuff box, a small book, and a candlestick. "I trust you've had your rest, Watson," he said, without looking up. "More than you, it seems," I replied. "Are you still working on the Vernet affair? I thought it concluded." He shook his head. "No case is ever truly concluded until every thread is tied, and this one is still fraying in several directions." I glanced down at the map. Various symbols had been penciled in at intervals around the city's perimeter. Triangles, circles, crosses, some linked with thin red lines. What are these markings? Locations where Charles Vernet made discreet purchases, visits, or inquiries over the past 6 months. I obtained this list through a contact at the British Museum who kept track of Vernet's correspondence. Note the clustering in the southeast. Greenwich? Precisely. The Royal Observatory, the Temple of Mithras ruins, 2 disused rail tunnels beneath Blackheath. Each site is tied to his final research. But this... He lifted a thin manuscript with a red ribbon binding. "This is the key." He handed it to me. The manuscript was written in Vernet's hand, pages of meticulously drawn symbols, interspersed with narrative entries, observations, and what appeared to be a personal journal. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Mrs. Vernet returned to her husband's private safe after the inquest and found it. She brought it to me yesterday, though I advised her not to speak of it to the authorities just yet. I flipped through the manuscript slowly. One entry caught my eye. They marked the city with symbols aligning not with stars but the ground beneath, lay paths older than Roman roads, and beneath these the vaults, sealed by script, protected by silence. I looked up. "You believe there's another chamber?" "I believe," Holmes said, standing, "that what we discovered beneath the Vernet house was only one part of a network. A gate, perhaps. And Vernet died before he could find the others." He crossed to the bookcase, pulled down a volume of ancient topographical maps and opened it alongside the city survey. "Now look here," he said, pointing to a page from the manuscript that featured 3 overlapping rings intersected by lines. He placed a compass on the map and began measuring. "Watson, tell me what sits at the meeting point of these 3 calculated lines." I leaned in. "Southwark, near the river. Isn't that where they recently demolished an old foundry?" "Exactly so," he said. "The iron coffer works closed 2 years ago. According to this, Vernet made an inquiry there in January. Nothing to raise alarm, just questions about subsoil and previous excavation permits." Holmes rolled up the maps. "Get your coat, Watson. We're going to the banks of the Thames." The rain was light, but persistent, as we arrived in Southwark. A scaffolding crew was still clearing debris from the foundry's remains. The site was largely deserted save for a single watchman and a mangy dog that barked at our approach. Holmes produced a forged permit, elegantly crafted, likely the work of his sometime associate in Whitechapel, and the watchman offered no objection as we stepped into the ruins. The building had been all but stripped to its stone skeleton. Twisted beams lay across puddles, and soot-blackened bricks formed unstable piles along the perimeter. Holmes moved quickly, consulting both the manuscript and his pocket compass. "Here," he said, arriving at a half-collapsed stairwell. "The map places it beneath the western loading area. There should be a cellar or sub-foundation vault." He found a rusted iron ring hidden beneath a wooden plank and heaved it upward, revealing a trap-door beneath. The air that issued from below was dank and cold. We descended carefully into darkness. Holmes lit his lantern, revealing a low chamber with arching brick supports. Unlike the chamber at the Vernet house, this room was dry, pristine, even purposeful. Strange symbols had been carved into the mortar of the walls, and several niches contained sealed amphorae and fragments of stone tablets. In the centre stood another slab, not black marble this time, but polished granite, etched with 3 perfect circles. Holmes approached it, placing Vernet's manuscript beside the markings. This is it. This is what he was trying to find. He traced the carvings with his gloved hand. Watson, imagine for a moment that beneath London lies a forgotten system. Not sewers, not Roman tunnels, but something older. A sacred geometry, perhaps. These circles are not mere decoration, they're alignment markers. And someone, perhaps a secret order, perhaps merely curious antiquarians, has been trying to reconnect with this ancient design. He stepped back. Vernet was close to discovering a pattern. He died not from madness, but from encroaching upon something others wished to remain buried. We examined the room in silence. No sound but the distant drip of water. It felt timeless. And then Holmes turned sharply. He lifted a discarded crate lid from the floor, revealing a torn scrap of paper. It bore the symbol from the scroll, 3 rings, but one had been crossed out in blood. "Someone else has been here," he murmured. I stiffened. "You don't suppose—" "I do. The Vernet affair is not yet concluded. Dyson was not the architect of this mystery. He was a pawn. Someone guided him." He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. "We are dealing with something far more deliberate, Watson. Something organized. Someone wants these ancient chambers reopened." As we climbed from the vault and stepped back into the cold drizzle of the Southwark afternoon, Holmes turned to me with that gleam in his eye I had come to know well. "We return to Baker Street. There are letters to write, and an old adversary I must consult. Chapter 6. The Return of Severine Darkmore." It was just past 10 the following morning when Holmes concluded his 5th letter and sealed it with wax. The correspondence, penned in his lean, decisive hand, was destined for institutions as varied as the British Museum, the Geological Society, and a private antiquities dealer in Vienna. I had watched in silence as he worked, fully aware that each word he wrote was another step into an increasingly intricate web of mystery. "Watson," he said at last, setting his pen aside, "we are no longer chasing shadows, we are hunting a man, a very specific man." "Then this wasn't just about Vernet's research?" "No," Holmes replied, rising to his feet. "Vernet uncovered something buried beneath layers of history, yes, but he was being watched, monitored, and when he strayed too close to something vital, he was silenced. Not by Dyson, he lacked the cunning, but by someone who has orchestrated such outcomes before." He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the bleak London skyline. "Do you recall, Watson, the affair of the Petrarch relics, the Church of Blooded Dawn, or the forged Ackman tablets?" I nodded slowly. "Of course. You believed all 3 linked to the same individual, but you never named him." "I had no proof," Holmes replied. "Only threads. But now the pattern is unmistakable. It's the work of Severine Darkmore." The name struck a chord in my memory. Dark, half-whispered references Holmes had made over the years. A former academic and antiquarian, Darkmore had vanished from public life a decade ago following a scandal involving the theft of Sumerian artifacts and a suspected ritual killing in Istanbul. Nothing was ever proven. Yet Holmes had long maintained that Darkmore had retreated underground, literally and figuratively, to continue his obsessive pursuit of primordial truths. "I believed him dead," Holmes continued, "but the symbolism, the manuscript annotations, and the architectural alignments Vernet discovered, these all bear the signature of Darkmore's methodology." "And you're certain he's here in London?" "I am certain," Holmes said grimly, "that he never left." He tapped the Southwark map still pinned to our table. Vernet's chamber was not the first, nor the last. Darkmore's work requires 3 sites. He always works in 3s: ritual, location, object. He picked up a fresh envelope. "This letter is addressed to Miss Evangeline Cabot, a former associate of Darkmore's from his Cambridge days. She was his only intellectual rival until he descended into obsession. If anyone knows where he is or how he thinks, it will be her." 2 hours later, we stood before a modest but elegant house in Bloomsbury. The brass plaque read, "Miss E. Cabot, Historian of Antiquity." Holmes rang the bell with a precision tap. Moments later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with stern features, softened only by the kindness of her eyes. "Mr. Holmes," she said without needing introduction. "You took longer than I expected." Holmes smiled. "Then you were expecting me?" "Not precisely, but when I read of Verney's death, I knew someone would come. Won't you step inside?" Her study was the antithesis of Verney's, a space of order and light filled with labelled scrolls and glass cabinets of curated relics. We sat in high-backed chairs while Miss Cabot poured tea from a silver pot. "You believe Severin is involved," she said directly. Holmes nodded. "You do as well?" "I know he is. He came to me 6 weeks ago." I leaned forward in surprise. "What did he want?" "To boast," she said bitterly. He spoke of rediscovery, of sacred lines beneath London, and the awakening of deep memory. He had grown thinner, more intense, but the same razor-sharp intellect. He mentioned Verney, said he was useful, but careless, that he would not last. Holmes leaned in. "Did he say where he was staying?" "No," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire. But he dropped a reference, slip perhaps. He said he would be returning to the vaulted roots. That phrase comes from an obscure passage in the Codex Altus. It refers to a Mithric crypt hidden beneath the original temple of Apollo that once stood where King's Reach now lies. Holmes stood. "Then that is where we must go." "But it's gone," she said. "Covered by the city, there is no access." Holmes's eyes lit. "Not above, but possibly from below." By dusk, Holmes and I stood once more amid the streets of Southwark, this time on the edge of a canal off King's Reach. A disused service tunnel ran beneath the embankment, boarded up decades earlier during river works. Holmes had, through his peculiar channels, obtained a copy of the waterway maintenance diagrams and now paced along the railing above the stone archway, studying every bolt and marking. "There," he said, pointing to an iron valve beside a rusted outflow gate. "The old sluice passage. It connects to the original storm chamber. From there, we may access the lower vaults." We climbed down by lantern light, navigating through damp, moss-covered stones. The water was only ankle deep, but the cold seeped into the bones. Holmes led with quiet certainty, ignoring side tunnels and blocked passages, until we arrived at a mossy stone arch with worn Latin inscriptions etched into its lintel. "This was part of the Mithraic structure," he said. "The real one, older than the Roman restoration. The markings match those from Verney's manuscript." He knelt and found a gap in the mortar along the arch's base. A lever. With a soft tug, a section of the wall shifted inward, revealing stairs carved directly into the rock, sloping downward into darkness. We descended. The air below was heavy, not musty, but dense, as though time itself resisted our intrusion. The stairs ended in a large chamber, round and smooth, its walls bare but for 3 alcoves. In each alcove was a stone pedestal. Only one bore a relic, a small bronze idol shaped like a man with the head of a hawk. Holmes approached it. "I've seen this before," he whispered. "At Cambridge, in Darkmore's dissertation, this idol was his obsession." Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. From the shadowed far end of the chamber emerged a man in a long grey coat, his hair silver, face gaunt and unreadable. His eyes, however, burned with unmistakable intensity. "Holmes," he said, at last. Holmes said nothing, but I felt a shift in him, a rare moment of pure focus. Severin Darkmore stepped forward, arms open in eerie welcome. "I have been expecting you." Chapter 7. A Dialogue in the Dark. The chamber was silent, but for the low drip of water from the ceiling and the soft scrape of our boots on ancient stone. Severin Darkmore stood at the far end like a figure carved from the shadows, the dim lantern light catching the angular contours of his pale face. He wore no disguise, no mask, only the unmistakable aura of a man convinced of the righteousness of his cause. Holmes took a single step forward, hands at his sides, utterly composed. "You've lost your subtlety, Darkmore," he said. "In the past, your hand was never seen, only the results. This time, there are fingerprints." Darkmore smiled faintly. "Subtlety is wasted on an audience that refuses to see. Charles Verney was not blind. He understood what was beneath him." "Then why is he dead?" Holmes asked flatly. "He was reckless. He wanted proof, the kind that draws attention. His mind was capable, but his spirit lacked discipline." "You murdered him?" Darkmore tilted his head. "No, Mr. Holmes. I did not lift a hand against him. His own dread undid him. A man standing at the edge of revelation sees either eternity or the abyss." I moved beside Holmes, revolver in hand, though Darkmore did not seem threatened. Holmes's voice was level. "You prey on minds like his. You lure them with forgotten scripts, symbols, mysteries, until they mistake delusion for discovery." Darkmore laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound. "You reduce this to mere trickery. Always the rationalist, Holmes. But even you must feel it, the weight of this place. These vaults predate your Roman roads, your Saxon kings. You walk on bones older than empire, what you call superstition, others preserved as sacred knowledge." Holmes remained impassive. "And what is it you seek in these sacred places? Power? Immortality? Continuity?" Darkmore said. "The preservation of a hidden truth. The ancients knew that memory lives in matter, that the earth remembers. This site is one of many, nodes of resonance. The circles Verney mapped were only the beginning. When aligned and activated—" Holmes interrupted, his tone sharpened. "You imagine you'll awaken something buried, some force, a new order?" "No," Darkmore said, eyes glittering. "An old one." He turned to the granite pedestal behind him and placed a hand on the hawk-headed idol. His fingers trembled slightly.
"This figure," he said, "is not a god in the mythological sense. It is a cipher, a formula. These carvings," he gestured to the surrounding walls, "are instructions. When Verney found the first chamber, the process began, but it is not complete," he faltered. Holmes advanced one step. "So you used Dyson. You gave him just enough to feed Vernet's curiosity, then manipulated him into silence when it went too far." "Dyson was willing," Darkmore replied. "He feared irrelevance. I offered him purpose." "And Barrow?" I asked. "A liability," he said without remorse. "One must prune rot from the roots." Holmes's expression hardened. "You're mad, Darkmore." Darkmore's eyes narrowed. "Madness is the refusal to evolve." At that moment, Holmes reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a slip of paper. He held it out. "Do you know what this is?" Darkmore glanced briefly, then looked away. "A forgery of my sigil, a child's imitation." Holmes folded the paper calmly. "On the contrary, it's a message left at Southwark after your last visit. Someone followed you. You're not as invisible as you think." Darkmore's expression faltered. Holmes continued. "I've traced 3 separate correspondences to your name, coded, of course, but recognizable. One sent to a scholar in Alexandria, another to a financier in Prague. You are not working alone." Darkmore's voice turned cold. "You presume to understand the scale of what's at hand?" "No," Holmes said. "I understand the danger of a man chasing his own mythology. This ends tonight." He drew his pistol, not pointed to kill, but aimed squarely at the idol. Darkmore's composure cracked. "You wouldn't." Holmes's voice dropped a pitch. "This relic is no more sacred than a chess piece to a master manipulator, but it's the cornerstone of your theatre. Remove it, and the stage collapses." Darkmore stepped back. "You don't know what you're doing?" "I know enough," Holmes replied. I could see Darkmore's fingers twitching again, edging toward his coat. I raised my revolver. "Don't," I warned. And for the first time I saw fear flicker in Severin Darkmore's face, not fear of death, but of something unraveling. Something he had spent years building now lay at the mercy of a man who refused to believe. He exhaled sharply. "You can destroy this. You can even stop me. But you cannot erase the pattern. Others will see it. Others will come." Holmes looked at him coolly. "Then let them find nothing." Darkmore took a final look at the chamber, then at the idol. "It is only sleeping," he said. And then, without warning, he bolted, swift as a jackal darting for the rear corridor. Holmes and I gave chase through the low tunnels. He led us in a twisting flight through passages not marked on any map. Then as we rounded a corner, we found the corridor collapsed. Stones and soil fallen, the passage blocked. Darkmore was gone. Back in the chamber, Holmes stood over the idol for a long while. Then he reached for a cloth from his bag and wrapped it carefully. "We cannot leave it here," he said. "He'll return for it if he can." "And the chamber?" Holmes turned. "We seal it." We returned with 2 constables from the local division, whom Holmes had warned in advance to be on standby. With their assistance and the support of city engineers, the vault was barred, the passage bricked up, and the surrounding site declared structurally unsafe, thus cordoned off by the borough indefinitely. As the final stones were set in place, Holmes turned away. The relic will go to the British Museum under lock and key, but we must ensure the narrative that surrounds it is reduced to dust. I glanced at him. Even if the truth is lost? He gave me a long look. Sometimes, Watson, truth must sleep with the dead. Better a forgotten myth than a living madness. That night, we returned to Baker Street under a darkening sky. Holmes, ever quiet after such resolutions, poured himself a brandy and stood at the hearth, watching the flames. "We have not heard the last of Darkmore," he said, almost to himself. "But you stopped him." "Temporarily, but belief is harder to kill than a man. And there are always others willing to follow symbols into the dark."
Chapter 8. Ashes and Echoes. It was a fortnight after our confrontation with Severin Darkmore, and the grey sprawl of London had resumed its customary rhythms, chiming trams, impatient footsteps, the daily ritual of smoke curling into the mist. Yet beneath its cobblestone calm, something had shifted. A shadow had passed over the city, unseen by most, but deeply felt by those who had looked too closely. I sat at my desk in Baker Street, reviewing my notes from the case, trying, perhaps vainly, to shape them into something coherent. Holmes, as was his custom in the days following a case of exceptional magnitude, had become introspective and largely silent, pacing with his pipe clenched between his teeth and ignoring all correspondence save the telegram from the British Museum confirming receipt of the idol. "Watson," he said suddenly that morning, "have you ever considered how little of the world is actually seen?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" Holmes walked to the window and parted the curtains slightly. The street below bustled with life. A carriage trundled past. A child chased a hoop. A man in a top hat checked his pocket watch before boarding a cab. "That man," Holmes said, pointing, "has passed by our window 3 times in the last week. Same coat, same habitual limp. A former soldier, likely Crimea, judging by the age and injury. And yet I wager no one else on this street has ever noticed him." He let the curtain fall. "It is not the hidden chambers or relics that concern me, Watson. It's how easy it is for the truth to be ignored, if only no one thinks to ask the right question." "You refer to Darkmore?" He gave a slow nod. "A man may vanish from society and still thrive within its cracks. He spoke of others who may yet pursue what Verney began. I do not think we've seen the last of this ideology. Myth, Watson, is remarkably durable." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel and a telegram on a silver tray. "From Miss Cabot," she said, setting them down. Holmes tore open the telegram first. His eyes flickered briefly as he read, "Parcel contains recovered pages, found in Holloway auction under false name. Be cautious. E. Cabot." He opened the parcel. Inside was a sheaf of parchment fragments browned with age, symbols scrawled in red ink, some smudged beyond recognition. A slip of card fell out, bearing only a single phrase in a familiar angular hand. "3 become 1. The last vault sleeps beneath the flood." Holmes sat back. "He's taunting us. You think it's genuine? I think it's deliberate. This was not left behind by accident. And if Darkmore was behind the auction, as Miss Cabot believes, then he means for us to continue following him." "But should we?" I asked. "The vaults have been sealed. The relic secured. We stopped him." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the side of his chair. "There's a difference between halting a man and halting his ideas. We have done the former. Whether we can prevent the latter remains to be seen." He stood and crossed to the mantel, staring into the fire. "You remember what he said, Watson, about the third site?" I did. 3 become 1. "According to Verney's notes," Holmes went on, "the third node, the last vault, was never identified, only theorized. But if Darkmore has located it—" He did not finish the sentence. After a long pause, he turned to me. "Do you recall our trip to Somerset, 3 years past? The excavation at Vendown? The Roman temple ruins?" "No," he said softly. "Older, beneath the temple. There was a chamber there, remember? Sealed in chalk and flint, unmapped. It was dismissed by the surveyor as natural erosion, but the design, circular, sunken with 3 channels." I blinked. "You think that's it?" "I think," Holmes said, "that a man like Darkmore would not leave anything to chance. He's been playing a long game." He placed the new pages beside the original manuscript. "These fragments were meant to be found, and I believe the next move is ours." The following day, Holmes requested a private audience with Inspector Gregson, who had assisted discreetly in the arrest of Dyson. They met at the Reform Club and returned with a quietly issued order. The Vernet house, now empty, would be sold to a historical trust under false name, thus ensuring no further excavation by the curious. Likewise, the site in Southwark was to remain permanently restricted by the City Council. You see, Holmes told me afterwards, if we cannot destroy the myth, we can bury it under bureaucracy. London has no shortage of red tape. But what of Somerset? I asked. Holmes said nothing for a while. Then, we wait? For what? For him. And so we waited. Weeks passed. Spring crept into the city. The idol, we learned, had been stored in a vault beneath the British Museum, alongside other curiosities deemed too obscure or too unsettling for public display. Miss Cabot, ever the scholar, offered to assist in transcribing the surviving pages from Vernet's manuscript under Holmes's condition of absolute secrecy. And as for Darkmore, he disappeared once more, vanishing into the corners of the world as if swallowed by the fog. But Holmes remained vigilant. He reviewed Vernet's notes every morning with the same intensity he applied to his violin, and he kept a map of ancient Britain above his desk, its corners peppered with pins, lines, and symbols only he understood. Late one evening, as we sat together over brandy, I asked him whether he believed it would all return, the vaults, the whispers, the strange relics beneath our feet. He regarded me with that expression I had seen too often before, composed, enigmatic, and tinged with melancholy. "It never left," he said. "It merely waits. And I, for one, intend to be ready." And so the case of Charles Vernet and the Whispering Vault came to an end, though, as with so many matters involving Holmes, the end felt rather like a beginning concealed in smoke and silence.